She's America's sweetheart, a billion-dollar box office queen, the actress adored by millions, or so it seems. But behind the glamour and glowing reputation, Julia Roberts has not always been welcome on every Hollywood set. In fact, she has been banned from multiple productions due to behind-the-scenes tensions and controversies. Yes, you heard that right. Despite her celebrated career, Roberts has faced reports of on-set clashes, professional disagreements, and even allegations of diva behavior. But what really happened? Was she truly difficult to work with, or was Hollywood turning against one of its biggest stars? Let's dive into the real story behind the headlines. Julia Roberts' journey to Hollywood's queen. Julia Roberts is definitely one of the most recognizable faces in Hollywood. You probably know her for her infectious smile, iconic roles, and undeniable star power. But behind the scenes, let's just say it hasn't been all rosy. She wasn't always the icon you see today, and her journey to the top of Hollywood wasn't all smooth sailing either. There were family struggles, heartbreaks, and even a few industry snubs along the way. Julia Fiona Roberts was born on October 28, 1967, in Smyrna, Georgia, a small town just outside Atlanta. From the start, it seemed like Julia was destined for Hollywood. Acting was in her blood. Her parents, Walter and Betty Lou Roberts, were drama teachers who ran an acting workshop for kids. And guess who attended their classes? None other than Martin Luther King Jr.'s children. The King family was so grateful for Julia's parents' kindness that they actually paid for her hospital bill when she was born. Imagine that. One of Hollywood's biggest stars had her first moments in the world covered by civil rights icons. But while her early life might sound glamorous, it was anything but that. Unfortunately, her parents' marriage fell apart, and they divorced when she was just 4 years old. When she was 10, her father tragically passed away from cancer, leaving Julia, her mom, and her 2 siblings, Eric and Lisa Roberts, to struggle financially. Things got even worse when her mother remarried. Reports suggest that Julia's stepfather may have treated her harshly during her childhood. To make matters worse, he didn't even have a job, so he couldn't really do much for them financially. Julia spent most of her childhood reading books, playing the clarinet, and dreaming about becoming a vet. Yep, definitely not an actress. But that all changed when her older brother, Eric Roberts, began making a name for himself in Hollywood. Watching him succeed planted the Hollywood bug in her mind, and she thought, if he could do it, why couldn't she? With big dreams but little experience, Julia packed her bags and moved to New York City in the late 80s. She started off small by enrolling in acting classes and attending countless auditions. She faced rejection after rejection until she landed her first real gig in the 1987 crime film Blood Red. Her role was a tiny one where she starred alongside her brother Eric. But here's the catch. The movie was so delayed that by the time it was released in 1989, Julia was already making a name for herself elsewhere. The real turning point in her career came in 1989 through the iconic movie Steel Magnolias. Here, she played a diabetic young woman in a powerhouse cast that included Sally Field, Dolly Parton, and Shirley MacLaine. Her emotional performance earned her an Oscar nomination for Best Supporting Actress. She didn't win, but Hollywood finally took notice. And then, just a year later, she landed the role that would change her life forever. At the age of 22, still fresh in Hollywood, Julia landed a role opposite the iconic Richard Gere in a movie about a call girl and a wealthy businessman who fall in love. That movie was Pretty Woman. And believe it or not, it wasn't expected to be a massive hit. In fact, the original script was a pretty dark drama, but after some rewrites and Julia's magnetic screen presence, the movie transformed into one of the most iconic romantic comedies of all time. And here's something most people don't know. Julia wasn't even the first choice for the role. Hollywood originally wanted Molly Ringwald or Meg Ryan, but they turned it down. Apparently, Diane Lane and Sandra Bullock were also considered for the role. But when Julia auditioned, she lit up the screen. Her chemistry with Richard Gere was undeniable, and suddenly, she went from a promising young actress to Hollywood's biggest sensation. She won a Golden Globe for her performance, and the movie made a whopping $463 million worldwide, an unheard-of amount for a rom-com at the time. This meant that overnight, Julia had become America's sweetheart. It was almost as if he could do no wrong. Every studio wanted her, and she delivered one blockbuster after another, proving she wasn't just a rom-com queen. But there was a problem. Despite being one of Hollywood's biggest stars, Behind the megawatt smile and America's sweetheart image, whispers, rumors, and outright accusations about her behavior on set began to emerge. What started off as mere rumors turned into extremely controversial scandals, and over the years, she's been called difficult, demanding, and even a nightmare to work with. But how much of this is true, and how much is just Hollywood gossip? Did Julia really make life miserable for directors and co-stars? Did the fame truly get to her head? Or was she just a strong woman in an industry that doesn't always like powerful women speaking up? Let's break it down. Julia's difficult to work with label. At first, most people tried to ignore the rumors and accusations. However, after what happened on the set of the 1991 movie Hook, people were beyond shocked and maybe convinced that Julia probably had some flaws when it came to working with people. In the live-action take on Peter Pan, which was directed by Steven Spielberg, Julia played Tinker Bell, but behind the scenes she reportedly wasn't so magical. Some crew members reportedly referred to her as Tinker Hell during the filming of Hook, and there were claims that she was sometimes moody, difficult to work with, and challenging to direct. Some claimed that the biggest issue seemed to be that she was isolated from the rest of the cast for most of the shoot, since her scenes as Tinker Bell were heavily effect-based. So, she often had to act alone in front of green screens, and this probably frustrated her. However, some people insisted that at the time, Julia was also going through personal drama and was at the center of one of the most scandalous cheating and breakup dramas in Hollywood history, and that was the reason for her terrible behavior. You see, Julia was engaged to fellow actor Kiefer Sutherland, and they were all set to have a lavish wedding. But just 3 days before they were supposed to walk down the aisle, extremely scandalous news hit the tabloids about Julia, sending shockwaves through Hollywood. Her fiancé at the time, Kiefer Sutherland, wasn't exactly a nobody. He was also making waves in Hollywood. He was known for his role in The Lost Boys, and was even considered one of the most promising young actors of his generation. Julia and Kiefer had met in 1990 on the set of Flatliners, and they instantly fell in love. The two young stars began dating, and before long, they were Hollywood's new it couple. Apparently, the romance was intense, and Kiefer was completely smitten with Julia. In fact, just a few months into dating, he proposed, and she said yes. The media went wild. Everyone was excited for them. This was supposed to be Hollywood's fairy tale wedding. The couple began planning an extravagant wedding scheduled for June 14, 1991. The venue was supposed to be the Fox Studios soundstage, transformed into a romantic garden setting for over 150 guests. However, it wasn't long before things started to go downhill. Rumors started swirling that Kiefer wasn't exactly the perfect fiancé. There were whispers that he was actually cheating on Julia with a stripper. The stripper in question later claimed that she and Kiefer had been involved for several months, and that their relationship continued even after he was engaged to Julia. She described him as a bad boy who loved partying and living on the edge, a disturbing image that didn't exactly fit with Julia's more wholesome, America's sweetheart image. Of course, Kiefer denied the cheating rumors, but the damage was done, and reports had it that Julia was completely heartbroken and furious. And so, just 3 days before the wedding, Julia called off her wedding to Kiefer Sutherland amid reports of his alleged infidelity. The invitations had been sent, the venue was ready, and guests were already making their way to Los Angeles for the big day. But suddenly, it was over. Julia didn't just cancel the wedding, she did something even more shocking. Following the breakup, she traveled to Ireland with actor Jason Patric, who was known to be a close friend of Kiefer Sutherland at the time. Talk about a plot twist. Instead of dealing with the breakup in Hollywood, Julia and Jason jetted off to some other place, where they were photographed laughing, walking hand in hand, and looking completely unbothered by the drama they had just left behind. But this just made an already complicated scandal even more controversial, because to outsiders it looked like Julia had dumped Kiefer for his best friend, and this just made her look just as bad as him. The media was thrown into a frenzy, with some people accusing Julia and Jason Patric of secretly seeing each other behind Kiefer's back. Some said that the wedding cancellation was just an excuse to go public with their romance. Others claimed that Julia was simply looking for comfort and a way to escape the drama, and Jason just happened to be there. Indeed, the breakup was extremely messy, so it's not surprising that Julia was in a bad mood while filming Hook, which took place while the scandal was still fresh. The director, Steven Spielberg himself, later admitted that Julia had a rough time on set. His exact words during an interview were, "It was not a great time for Julia and me to be working together." In fact, when asked if he'd ever work with her again, his response suggested that he wasn't down for that. Even Julia also acknowledged her bad behavior on Hook years later, noting that at that time she was in a terrible emotional state. But was Hook just a one-time thing? Or did this attitude follow her into other productions? Well, maybe it did, because in 1999, Julia reunited with Richard Gere for Runaway Bride, and while the two stars had great chemistry on screen, some reports suggested that Julia had become more demanding behind the scenes. By this time, she was already one of Hollywood's highest-paid actresses, earning over $15 to $20 million per movie, so she had more power on set. Some insiders actually claimed that the actress wasn't exactly a sweetheart behind the cameras. They alleged she was picky about her costumes, wanted script changes, and even had issues with the director, Gary Marshall. However, Gary had directed Julia before in Pretty Woman, and he only had good things to say about her. So the question is, was Julia really being difficult, or was she just a powerful woman who knew what she wanted? But that's not all we've heard about the actress. Julia Roberts might be America's sweetheart, but behind the scenes, she's also had her fair share of Hollywood feuds and icy relationships with co-stars. But what really went down with most of these feuds that earned Julia this negative reputation of being a pain to work with? Julia's feud with Nick Nolte. Perhaps Julia's most explosive and long-lasting feud was with her I Love Trouble co-star, Nick Nolte. Now, co-stars having tension on set isn't unheard of and can be completely normal. But Julia and Nick reportedly had significant on-set tension that went beyond typical co-star disagreements. In a 1994 interview with the New York Times, she said, "From the moment I met him, we sort of gave each other a hard time. And naturally, we got on each other's nerves. But then she shocked everyone when she took it a step further by calling him disgusting and saying that he was also horribly mean." Her exact words were, "While he can be completely charming and very nice, he's also completely disgusting. He's going to hate me for saying this, but he seems to go out of his way to repel people. He's a kick. Ouch." On the other hand, Nick Nolte did not take that insult lightly. He clapped back, saying, "It's not nice to call someone disgusting, but she's not a nice person. Everyone knows that." You're probably wondering what must have happened between these two actors to warrant such comments. Well, according to insiders, Julia and Nick were constantly fighting on set, to the point where they refused to shoot scenes together unless absolutely necessary. Their scenes were even rewritten, so that their characters could have more moments apart. When they did have to film together, they reportedly played childish pranks on each other. Julia would mock him openly, and Nick would deliberately annoy her just to make things worse. Nolte, however, later admitted that a part of the tension they had could have been his fault. He said, "I mean, it was absurd what we went through. It was partly my fault and a little bit of hers. Julia got married at the beginning of that film, and it was one of those things where I just approached it all wrong." Apparently, even after the movie was released, they never buried the hatchet. Unlike other Hollywood feuds that eventually fade, Julia and Nick's reported on-set feud has remained a memorable Hollywood controversy. And considering how petty both of them were during filming, it's safe to say they'll never be working together again. However, there was one time Julia Roberts exited a movie project before filming began, shocking not just the producers but the entire industry. Julia quits Shakespeare in Love. Julia Roberts has had her pick of iconic roles, but did you know she was originally set to star in Shakespeare in Love in 1998? That's right. Before Gwyneth Paltrow stepped into the role and won an Oscar for it, Julia was the first choice to play the role of Viola de Lesseps. The film had been developed with Julia in mind, and the studio was banking on her star power to make it a massive hit. But just a few weeks before filming was supposed to start, Julia walked away from the project, causing delays and financial setbacks for the production team. By the mid-90s, Julia Roberts was practically Hollywood royalty and had become one of the most sought-after actresses in the industry, with studios lining up to cast her in their biggest films. So when Shakespeare in Love was in development, Producers knew they needed a major A-list actress to play Viola, and who better than Julia Roberts? The studio was so confident in Julia's involvement that they immediately started securing funding, convinced that her star power alone would guarantee a blockbuster. They even started production planning, with director Edward Zwick working closely with Julia to bring the project to life. But there was one major problem. The role of William Shakespeare hadn't been cast yet, and that's where things started to go downhill. You see, one of the biggest reasons Julia was excited about Shakespeare in Love was because she had a dream co-star in mind to play the role of William Shakespeare, and that was the one and only Daniel Day-Lewis. Daniel was already an Academy Award-winning actor, known for his intense method acting style, and Julia was super convinced that he was the only person who could play William Shakespeare opposite her Viola. Reports had it that she even personally reached out to him, sending letters to convince him to take the role, but Daniel simply wasn't interested. Sadly, he turned the offer down because he had already committed to another project, and let's just say, Julia was completely devastated. She reportedly begged the producers to delay filming so they could wait for Daniel, but the studio refused because they had already started spending money on production, and they couldn't afford to wait. Now, this is where things began to crumble, and Julia's enthusiasm for the project began to die. Since Daniel Day-Lewis was out, the producers started auditioning other actors for the role of William Shakespeare. They brought in Ralph Fiennes, who would later go on to play Voldemort in Harry Potter, along with a few other British actors, hoping one of them would impress Julia. But when they did chemistry tests with Julia, things didn't go well. Julia was not impressed by any of the actors. She felt like none of them had the magic or charm to play Shakespeare. The producer of the show eventually confessed that Julia had a series of completely disastrous chemistry reads, and this was because she didn't put in any effort. He said, "Even as Ralph did his best to elicit the famous smile, Julia barely acknowledged him. I'm not suggesting she was deliberately sabotaging, but it was a disaster nonetheless. I tried to catch Ralph's eye to apologize as he left, but he couldn't get out of there fast enough. After he was gone, I turned to Julia, awaiting her reaction. 'He isn't funny,' is all she said. And then, to make things even worse, Julia was struggling with her accent. It wasn't just about the chemistry with her co-star anymore. Julia had started to feel like she was out of her depth. The producer revealed that on the morning of the screen test, when Julia opened her mouth to read the script, everyone instantly noticed that something was wrong, and the problem wasn't with the script. It was with the fact that she hadn't put in any effort to perfect her British accent for the film. Edward said he tried to speak to her about the accent issue, but the worst was yet to come because by the next morning, Julia's manager informed him that the actress had flown back to the United States and that she was leaving the project. But here's where things get messy. You see, Julia's decision to quit threw the entire production into chaos. By the time she left, the studio had already spent $6 million preparing for the film, including location scouting, costume design, and set construction. And with Julia gone, the movie was officially dead in the water. This was a huge loss for the studio, with the producers eventually admitting, "I've never spoken to Julia again. Instead, I've observed from afar as her work grew in depth and stature. I bear her no ill will. She was a frightened 24-year-old. I wasn't much older, trying to act grown up as I watched the Globe Theatre torn down, and with it my dreams of grandeur." This sounds dramatic, but keep in mind that the producers had to start from scratch, delaying the entire production while they searched for a new leading lady. Eventually, they cast Gwyneth Paltrow, who stepped into the role, and the rest is history. Shakespeare in Love became a massive success, winning 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture and Best Actress for Gwyneth. Meanwhile, Julia has rarely addressed her exit from the film publicly. But deep down, we can't help but wonder if she regrets walking away from an Oscar-winning role. But Hollywood sets and colleagues aren't the only things Julia has had issues with. Do you know that an advert with Julia's face plastered all over it was once banned in the United Kingdom for the most surprising reason ever? Julia's advertising campaign banned. At this point, it's pretty clear that Julia Roberts has been the face of Hollywood glamour for decades, and for good reasons too. Her megawatt smile, flawless skin, and timeless beauty make her the perfect choice for luxury brands looking to sell the dream of eternal youth. So when L'Oreal signed her as the global ambassador for their Lancôme brand, no one was surprised. However, what did shock everyone was the fact that one of her biggest advertising campaigns ever was suddenly banned, and not for the reason you might think. In 2011, L'Oreal's luxury brand Lancôme launched a massive campaign for their Taint Miracle Foundation, starring none other than Julia Roberts. The ad featured Julia looking stunningly radiant, her skin appearing flawless, smooth, and glowing. The message of the campaign was simple. This foundation could give you the same radiant, youthful complexion just like Julia Roberts. But while this sounds harmless, there was one huge problem. Unfortunately, Julia's face in the ad campaign looked so perfect that it didn't even look real anymore. Her skin had been heavily retouched, making her look decades younger with zero wrinkles, fine lines, or blemishes. Even for Hollywood standards, the airbrushing was extreme. And that's when the backlash started. The controversy began brewing in the United Kingdom when Liberal Democrat politician Joe Swinson, who was very passionate about fighting against unrealistic beauty standards in advertising, formally complained to the Advertising Standards Authority. She argued that the advert was misleading and set unrealistic beauty expectations for women. She also called for beauty brands to quit exposing young girls to advertisements that imply that they should strive for perfection that simply doesn't exist. She also went ahead to accuse the beauty industry of manipulating images so much that they no longer represent real human faces. And in Julia's case, the Advertising Standards Authority agreed. After investigating the advert, they ruled that it had been excessively retouched, giving consumers a false impression of what the foundation could actually do. And so, the advert was banned by the UK Advertising Standards Authority for excessive retouching. Of course, after the ruling, L'Oreal tried to defend the campaign, saying that the advert had been digitally enhanced but that Julia Roberts really does have naturally glowing skin. They argued that she was already extraordinarily beautiful, and that the retouching was simply used to lighten shadows, smooth skin tone, and reduce imperfections, not to completely change her appearance. But the authorities weren't buying it. Just like that, the adversary was gone. For Julia, the scandal wasn't exactly her fault. She wasn't the one who edited the photos, and she probably didn't have much say in the final campaign. But still, her name was all over the controversy, and it did some damage because some critics argued that she should have spoken out against the unrealistic editing instead of allowing it to fly. But Julia stayed completely silent about the controversy. Speaking of staying silent, do you know that Julia once completely disappeared from the rom-com genre? We're talking pin-drop silence. For 2 whole decades, Julia Roberts didn't star in a single rom-com. And of course, fans were confused. Why did she walk away from the romantic comedies that made her a superstar? You'll be surprised to find out why. Julia's 20-year break from rom-coms. For most of the 90s and early 2000s, Julia Roberts was in numerous romantic comedies. As a matter of fact, her movies weren't just box office hits, they were cultural moments. Millions of people fell in love with her charm, her iconic smile, and the way she made every love story feel magical and real at the same time. But after America's Sweethearts in 2001, she suddenly went cold, leaving fans desperate for answers. Well, it turns out that one of the biggest reasons Julia Roberts stayed away from rom-coms was the fact that the scripts just weren't good enough. Julia says that Hollywood changed in the 2000s, and that romantic comedies became predictable, less exciting, and often lazy rehashes of old ideas. The genre that had once been smart, witty, and full of heart was turning into forgettable, formulaic fluff, and she knew she couldn't just continue doing just any rom-com. It had to be special. In an interview, she explained, "People sometimes misconstrue the amount of time that's gone by, and that I haven't done a romantic comedy because I don't want to do one. If I had read something that I thought was that Notting Hill level of writing or My Best Friend's Wedding level of madcap fun, I would do it." Well, this meant that she wasn't going to do a rom-com just for the sake of doing one. She was waiting for the right story. And for 20 years, it never came. Another major reason Julia stepped away? Well, let's just say she wanted to be taken seriously as an actress. Romantic comedies had made her a global superstar, all right, but Hollywood has a bad habit of putting actors in boxes. For years, she was seen as the funny, lovable rom-com lead, but she knew she could do so much more, and she wanted deeper and more dramatic roles. In fact, in an interview, she confessed that she had gotten too much life experience to play another hopeless romantic or damsel in distress. In the middle of all this, Julia was also starting a new chapter in her personal life. She married Danny Moder, a cinematographer, in 2002, and they had 3 kids together. Of course, juggling being a mom and a big movie star isn't exactly the easiest job, so Julia decided to embrace being a full-time mom. She moved away from the Hollywood scene, choosing to raise her family in New Mexico instead of Los Angeles. She became more selective with her roles, prioritizing her personal life. And thankfully, after 2 decades, she shocked everyone by starring in Ticket to Paradise with George Clooney. It was the perfect comeback, and audiences loved seeing her back where she belonged. Now that Julia Roberts has returned to the world of romantic comedies, the big question remains: will she continue? One thing is certain: her charm and talent have made her a timeless icon in the genre. What do you think? Should she take on more rom-coms, or would you rather see her in dramatic roles? Let us know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and check out the next one on your screen for more updates.